Chapter 2. Appointment with Death. Upon leaving the lab, Ken instinctively drove toward the coastal hills. So many times he had gone there in the past to wander in the woods and think tough problems through to a solution. This time, however, when he found himself on the winding mountain road that he knew so well, and facing the late afternoon sun that was about to sink into the Pacific, just beyond the range he was climbing, he could not remember how he'd gotten there. Nor could he remember, somewhere along the route, pushing James Taylor's Sweet Baby James into the tape deck. Its nostalgic sounds blared at him from the stereo on his Mercedes SL 600. In spite of the wealth his computer company had brought him, Ken was far too dedicated to his goals to have time for the many luxuries he could so easily afford. The Mercedes was one symbol of success he allowed, the one possession that possessed him. It was his pride and joy. Yet now he had the bizarre feeling that this finely tuned machine, which had always been instantly responsive to his lightest touch, was fighting him, like some living, breathing, untamed animal. Even that strange realization seemed vague and unreal. Only one thought obsessed him now: the terrifying imperative to escape from an elusive but dread memory. That haunting nightmare became steadily clearer and more painful as the eerie voices hammered the same phrases repeatedly and loudly inside his throbbing head. You've reached Omega, Omega, the superluminum, superluminum, superluminum. It was more than a memory. The metallic, menacing command seemed to be emanating from his very soul, as though he now belonged to the Nine, whoever they were. Each stabbing sound heightened his desire to escape and the panic of knowing he could not. His brilliant mind, the genius that had intimidated the proudest intellects, what good was it all now? A strange transformation was taking place in his physical perceptions. The Mercedes that he had been battling began to feel more and more like an extension of himself. Then the two of them were somehow one shared being, flesh and machine fused into the same essence. His arms were now frozen to the steering wheel, moving as it moved in wild maneuvers, and his foot and leg were part of the pumping accelerator that goaded the pulsating hulk to its limits. At the same time, on another level, he knew he was acting irrationally. But that wild surge of power seemed his only hope for retaliation against the haunting voices, even if it meant his own destruction. That would silence them. The thought was insane and he knew it, but still his foot ground into the floorboard in obedience to some inner command. We Nine will guide you. You must open yourself. Open yourself. The road had narrowed and steepened sharply, becoming a seemingly endless succession of dangerous curves winding along the edge of a deep and precipitous gorge. The brilliant blue of sky, the trees rushing by with the setting sun slanting through their branches, the surging power that engulfed him. It was exhilarating. He'd had that same feeling at the first moment of contact with the Nine, and now, as then, ecstasy metamorphosed into fear and confusion. On a blind curve, the Mercedes swept effortlessly around a laboring truck laden with hay, as though it were standing still. It was a deadly chance that he would never take in his right mind, but something irresistible was now in control. The realization that he was more than playing with death, that he had an actual appointment with it, seemed vague and unimportant. Is this all a dream? In stunned and frozen fascination, he watched as a huge cobra slithered out from under the dashboard and up between his legs. It stared at him with unblinking, hooded eyes, then wrapped itself quickly around his left arm. Ken screamed in terror and clawed desperately for its neck, but his free hand found only empty air. Yet it was there. Its eyes stared hypnotically into his, and its darting tongue flicked menacingly. His terrified preoccupation with the hideous serpent was shattered by the sudden sound of squealing brakes and a blaring horn, and the terrible realization that he had wandered across the narrow road's double line and into the lane of oncoming traffic. In one instant, the deadly serpent vanished, and in its place, filling his vision, were a truck and a trailer loaded with huge redwood logs, heading directly toward him. The truck driver braked and swerved frantically. Ken pulled the steering wheel desperately to the right. For a split second, Ken thought he'd made it, until the truck's huge bumper struck the left rear fender of his car with a deafening impact, flipping the Mercedes over the guardrail and sending it catapulting nearly 500 feet down a precipitous, rock-strewn slope. The crumbled mass of twisted and pounded metal dropped the last 20 feet straight down into a dry creek bed in the bottom of the canyon. Landing with a sickening crunch that Ken never heard, the car sat wedged into the narrow crevice between two massive boulders. The steep terrain and tall trees made it impossible to call in a helicopter. When paramedics finally reached the wreckage, they found Ken unconscious and still strapped in by the seatbelt that would have been given credit for saving his life if he survived. In spite of the enormous blood loss from multiple compound fractures and the piercing of a lung by one of his broken ribs, there was barely a detectable pulse. It took more than an hour to cut him out of the twisted metal tomb and haul him up the cliff. Intubated immediately and respirated by hand with the ammu bag, he was still clinging to life by the slenderest of threads. Using a large bore needle, the paramedics started an IV of normal saline as the racing ambulance reached the hospital in Palo Alto. There, the blood transfusions began in concert with emergency surgery. Two of the best surgeons in the country, Dr. Harold Elliott and his assistant, worked heroically but, by their own estimation, futilely. The patient had fixed dilated pupils and no spontaneous respiration. Yet his CT scan was normal, indicating that the coma was not due to intracerebral hemorrhaging. Diffuse brain injury, possibly secondary to hypoxia, Elliott's assistant muttered matter-of-factly with a scowl. Worst possible diagnosis. We're probably wasting our time. Maybe, was all Elliott replied as he cut and sewed rapidly. He was thinking of another and possibly even more hopeless explanation for the coma, a non-medical one that his assistant would scoff at, so there was no point in mentioning it. We could schedule an MRI if he survives long enough, suggested the assistant. Perhaps, said Elliott, preoccupied with other thoughts. The patient's name was well known to anyone who kept current with the local news. The guy's an outspoken promoter of Eastern mysticism and psychic powers. As involved in that stuff as he's been, he could be heavily demonized. That could explain his peculiar unconscious state. Maybe. By the time the two surgeons had put their instruments down, Ken's fiancée, Carla Bertelli, had arrived at the hospital. The young woman that now nervously paced the waiting room floor had gotten her master's degree in journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, 7 years after Ken's double doctorate. They had met when Carla attended a guest lecture series Ken had given on parapsychology at the university. It had been love at first sight for both of them. She had admired his genius, sense of humor, and especially his suave humanism and clever put-down of all religions that reinforced her own rejection of the Christian faith in which she'd been raised. And he had seen in her, in addition to everything else a man could ever want in a woman, that rare tenacity of purpose that reflected his own. At first, Ken had made frequent trips to date Carla. At times, however, it might be a 2-hour drive each way between Palo Alto and Berkeley, depending on the traffic. Ken was already putting in 16-hour days developing computer programs. When he added psychic research on top of that, there wasn't much time left for romance. From her Italian father, Carla had inherited her olive skin and large, dark, almond-shaped eyes. Her Irish mother had endowed her with auburn hair and long-limbed beauty. Winsomely affectionate, stubbornly determined, and loyal, Carla was a dream come true for the dedicated young scientist. Pursued by other suitors, she had kept faith with the man she loved, even when he had become all too involved with a double career to have the time and energy to make the long drive except on rare weekends. Carla was much like Ken in that respect. Once she'd determined upon an objective, there was no turning aside. It was that way with everything. She had turned down several promising offers from modeling agencies in order to pursue the career in journalism that had been her calculated goal since high school. Carla spent 2 years with the Wall Street Journal and another 2 with the Washington Post, then decided to freelance. She had found day-to-day reporting on corporate takeovers and Wall Street scandals less than challenging and had set her sights on a Pulitzer Prize. To be free to pursue the big story when it came along, that was now what she wanted. Ken had eventually flown to the East to tell Carla how much he missed her, and it took little persuasion to convince her to move back to Palo Alto. She'd never lost a deep interest in parapsychology, which Ken's electrifying lectures had earlier aroused, and under his tutelage she had begun to write articles on the subject. It was an enthusiasm that her editors had not shared at first. Divulging information that no one else knew, Ken had fed her selected data about his own secret research and introduced her to the most famous scientists in the field. It was not surprising, then, that the young woman who was soon to marry Ken Inman had already become recognized among the world's journalists as one of the top experts in parapsychology. Indeed, she had given a new and badly needed respectability to such reporting. Carla leaped to her feet apprehensively the moment the tall, graying doctor in green surgical scrubs walked into the waiting room and looked around. She was attracted immediately by his face. It had to be the kindest she could remember ever seeing. Is he? She had already learned from emergency the details of the accident and the grim prognosis, and didn't know how to finish the question, will he? I'm Dr. Elliot. She felt her outstretched hand enveloped warmly in both of his. He's in a coma, but clinging to life, barely. We've done all we can. There's a slim chance he may survive, but the damage is so severe we'll just have to wait and see. He paused for a moment and then put a sympathetic hand on her arm. We haven't determined the cause of his coma, he added solemnly, and that's not good. May I see him? We're getting married next month. I'm sorry, no visitors until we get him stabilized and in the intensive care unit. We don't know how long that will be. Why don't you leave your phone number at the nurse's station? They'll notify you when it's okay to come in. There's really no point in waiting around here. The best thing you can do now is to get some rest and pray. Carla looked momentarily startled. She thought, pray? Are you really serious? I'm counting on Ken's determination to live and your medical skill. How can I trust a doctor who mixes modern science with Dark Ages mumbo-jumbo? Thanks, she responded, a bit icily in spite of her attempt not to show her feelings. But I don't believe in prayer, and neither does Ken. She didn't mean to be ungracious, but honesty about what she believed was very important to her. No false impressions, no compromise of principles, especially when it mattered so much. Well, I believe in God, responded Dr. Elliot softly, looking her straight in the eye. So I pray for each of my patients, and you'd be amazed at how often he graciously answers prayer. And in this case, it wouldn't be honest if I gave you the impression that there's any other hope.